She helped a homeless man. She never expected it to be Morgan Freeman. Morgan Freeman had spent his life in the spotlight, his name synonymous with power, wisdom, and wealth. But tonight, under the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, none of that mattered. His wallet, gone. His phone, stolen. And for the first time in decades, Morgan Freeman was just another man lost in the night. Is kindness true power? Comment 1 for yes, 0 for no. The night air was sharp against Morgan's skin, the chill cutting through his thin jacket like a blade. A few hours ago, he had been in the back of a luxury car, heading to a 5-star hotel. Now he was barely keeping himself standing in a dark alley, bruised and stripped of everything that once defined him. The city moved on without him. People passed by, some casting a glance, others too absorbed in their own lives to notice the legendary actor reduced to nothing. Morgan tried calling out, but without a suit, without a chauffeur waiting by the curb, he was invisible. No power, no status, just a man with nothing. A neon sign flickered in the distance, a small, run-down diner, standing like an island in the middle of the cold, indifferent world. With nowhere else to go, Morgan pushed open the door. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon wrapped around him like a forgotten memory. The place was nearly empty. A single waitress wiped down a counter, her back turned. She didn't know who he was, didn't see the fame, the wealth, the history, but when she finally turned and their eyes met, Morgan Freeman had always believed that true wealth wasn't just about money, but about influence, about control. But tonight he had none of it. The night had started like any other. Morgan had landed in Chicago for a short business trip, a quick stop in a city he rarely visited, just enough time for meetings, a quiet dinner, and some solitude before heading back to his life of prestige. But fate had other plans. He had just stepped out of his hotel for a short walk when they came. A group of men, shadows in the dim alleyway, swift and merciless. There was no conversation, no chance to reason, just hands grabbing, pulling, shoving, the sharp metallic glint of a knife flashing under the streetlights, and then pain, a sharp jab to his ribs, a knee to his stomach, and before he could even react, he was on the ground, breathless, vulnerable, powerless. The men disappeared into the night just as quickly as they had come, leaving Morgan sprawled on the pavement. His wallet? Gone. His watch? Gone. His phone? Vanished. All that remained was the dull ache of bruises forming across his body, and the stunning realization that for the first time in decades, he was nobody. Morgan staggered to his feet, gripping the wall beside him for support. The busy streets of Chicago continued as if nothing had happened. People walked past him, some stealing a glance, others pretending not to see. No one stopped. No one asked if he was all right. No one recognized the legendary actor who had graced screens for decades. Without his fine suit, without his expensive car, without his aura of wealth, he was just another man. Just another nameless figure lost in the night. He opened his mouth, tried to call out, but his voice sounded small, weak, and for the first time in a very, very long time, he felt fear. Not fear of pain, not fear of losing money, but fear of being invisible. He didn't know how long he walked, didn't know where his feet were taking him. All he knew was that he needed warmth, shelter, something, anything to remind him that he still existed. That was when he saw the diner, a small, run-down place barely noticeable between the towering city buildings. A flickering neon sign read, "Emmy's Diner, open 24 hours." It wasn't a place he would have ever noticed before, not a place he would have ever stepped into, but right now, it was the only place that welcomed him. Taking a shaky breath, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. The warm aroma of coffee and grilled food hit him immediately. The place was nearly empty. Just a few late-night diners hunched over their plates, lost in their own worlds. And behind the counter, wiping down a glass, stood Emily Carter. She was young, maybe late 20s, with tired eyes but a warm smile. She glanced up when the bell above the door chimed, and froze when she saw him. Not because she recognized him, but because she saw what no one else did. She saw a man who had just been broken by the world. Morgan hesitated at the entrance, suddenly aware of how he looked. Bruised, disheveled. Nothing like the man he used to be. For a moment, he thought she might ask him to leave, tell him this wasn't his place. Instead, she smiled, a genuine, simple human smile. "Rough night?" she asked gently. Morgan swallowed. His voice felt foreign to him when he spoke. "You could say that." Emily gestured to a booth near the window. "Take a seat, I'll get you some coffee." He didn't know why, but in that moment her kindness nearly undid him. The coffee arrived first, steaming and rich, and Morgan wrapped his fingers around the cup like it was the only thing grounding him. Then a plate, scrambled eggs, a stack of toast. A simple meal, but to Morgan, it was the most important plate of food he had ever received. He looked up at Emily. I don't have any money." Emily shrugged. "Then it's on me." Morgan stared at her. "Why?" Emily tilted her head, thinking for a moment. Then she smiled again. "Because you look like someone who could use a little kindness." Morgan had met presidents, kings, CEOs. He had spoken to the most powerful people in the world, and yet, at that moment, he had never been more humbled. For years, Morgan had believed that power and wealth defined a person. But tonight, he was learning. Sometimes the only thing that matters is a simple act of kindness. Morgan Freeman sat in the small diner, staring down at the simple meal in front of him. The world outside didn't care that he had lost everything tonight. The busy streets, the well-dressed people walking past him without a second glance. It all felt like a harsh reminder that power was only as good as the moment you held on to it. But here, inside this tiny, forgotten diner, he had been given something he hadn't expected. Not pity, not curiosity, but kindness. And somehow that was more unsettling than anything else. Emily Carter moved around the diner with quiet efficiency, refilling coffee cups, clearing plates, offering small smiles to the few late-night customers. Morgan watched her, trying to make sense of her unshaken generosity. "Why are you doing this?" he asked finally, his voice quieter than usual. Emily turned back toward him, raising an eyebrow. "Doing what?" Morgan gestured at the plate, the coffee, the warmth she had given him without question. "This, helping a stranger for no reason." Emily leaned against the counter, folding her arms. "Who said there's no reason?" Morgan blinked. "Is there?" Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded toward the bruise forming along his jaw. "I don't know what happened to you out there, but you walked in here looking like the world had chewed you up and spit you out. You needed a meal, so I gave you one. That's the reason." Morgan tilted his head. "And if I had been lying? If I had just been looking for a free meal?" Emily shrugged. "Then I'd rather take the risk of feeding someone who doesn't need it than turn away someone who does." Her words hit harder than Morgan expected, because in all his years of wealth and power, in all the extravagant dinners and exclusive invitations, he had never met someone who thought like that. Morgan took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle in his chest. "You know who I am, don't you?" he asked finally. Emily smirked. "You mean aside from guy who had the worst night ever?" Morgan let out a quiet chuckle. It was the first real laugh he had felt all night. "Yeah, aside from that." Emily leaned against the counter, tapping a finger against her chin. "I mean, sure, I recognize you, but that doesn't really matter, does it?" Morgan raised an eyebrow. "Doesn't matter." Emily shook her head. "Not to me. You were famous 5 hours ago. Then the universe decided to remind you that you're still just human." Morgan fell silent, because she was right. He had spent years believing his name carried weight, that his wealth separated him from the struggles of everyday people. But tonight he was just another man who had been knocked down by life, and for the first time in a long time he wondered, had he ever truly understood what it meant to struggle? Morgan pushed his empty plate away, running a hand over his face. "You ever feel like the world just takes things away, just to remind you that you're not as untouchable as you think?" Emily chuckled. "All the time, but I think it also gives things back in unexpected ways. Morgan looked up at her, intrigued. Like what? Emily shrugged. Like this diner. It's not much, but it keeps me going, and every once in a while I get to do something good for someone who needs it. She nodded at him. Like you. Morgan frowned. I don't deserve that. Emily smirked. Good thing kindness isn't about what people deserve. Morgan exhaled, blown away by the simplicity of her words. In his world, every favor had a price. Every connection had an agenda. But Emily? She had nothing to gain. And yet she had given anyway. Morgan reached into his pocket out of habit, only to remember he had nothing left. No wallet, no phone, no way to repay her. Emily must have noticed because she chuckled. You don't have to look so guilty. This one's on me. Morgan leaned forward, his voice softer now. How do you do that? Emily raised an eyebrow. Do what? Trust people. Give without expecting anything back. Emily considered that for a moment before answering. Because I know what it feels like to have nothing. Her words sent a shockwave through Morgan. He had spent a single night in this position, and it had shaken him to his core. But Emily? Emily lived in this world every single day, and yet she had never lost her kindness. Morgan sat back, staring at his empty plate. I owe you, he said finally. Emily shook her head. No, you don't. Morgan held her gaze. I do. She let out a soft laugh. All right then. If you really feel that way, just do something good for someone else when you get the chance. Morgan nodded, his voice steady. I will. And for the first time that night, he meant it. Morgan Freeman left the diner that night with no money, no power, and no certainty of what came next. But he had something else, something he hadn't expected. A promise. A simple vow given over a cup of coffee and a plate of food. Do something good for someone else when you get the chance. And Morgan Freeman wasn't a man who broke his promises. The morning sun had just begun to rise over Chicago when Morgan found himself back in front of his hotel. The same building where he had left his wealth, his reputation, his old life, just hours ago. But something felt different now. The doorman didn't recognize him as he stepped inside, his clothes still wrinkled from the night before. The receptionist hesitated when he approached the front desk, her polite smile faltering as she took in his disheveled appearance. Sir, can I help you? She asked cautiously. Morgan reached for his pockets, then stopped. Of course. His wallet was gone. His phone, his ID, everything that proved he was Morgan Freeman gone. For a moment, panic flashed through him. Had he really become that dependent on the symbols of his success? I need to speak to the manager, he said, his voice quieter than usual. The receptionist gave him a skeptical look. Do you have a reservation? Morgan exhaled. I don't have anything right now. The receptionist's polite smile tightened. Sir, if you don't have a reservation, I'm afraid we can't. Check the name, Morgan interrupted. Morgan Freeman. She blinked. For a long moment, she just stared at him. Then, hesitantly, she typed the name into her computer. And when she looked up, her entire demeanor changed. Mr. Freeman, I'm so sorry, sir. We've been trying to reach you. Morgan smiled slightly. Funny. Just an hour ago, he had been invisible. Now? Now the world suddenly cared again. But he wasn't sure if he did. Back in his suite, Morgan finally let himself breathe. The familiar luxury of the penthouse wrapped around him like a security blanket. But as he sat down, the night's events played over in his mind. The mug of coffee. The warmth of the diner. Emily's words. If you really feel that way, just do something good for someone else when you get the chance. Morgan stared at the golden phone sitting on his bedside table. A direct line to assistants, drivers, security. He could call someone right now, have them wire money to that little diner, send Emily a check big enough to change her life. It would be easy, it would be efficient, but it would also be wrong. Because Emily hadn't helped him for money. She had helped him because she believed in something bigger than wealth. And if he wanted to keep his promise, he couldn't just throw money at it. He had to do something real. Morgan reached for his phone, but this time it wasn't his assistant he called, it was someone who could actually make a difference. "I need you to find out everything you can about a woman named Emily Carter," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And when you do, let me know how I can change her life." The person on the other end hesitated. "Sir, do you know her personally?" Morgan smiled. "I do now." He hung up, feeling something he hadn't felt in years. Excitement. Not for another movie role, not for another business deal, but for a chance to keep his word. And for the first time in a long time, Morgan Freeman felt like he was about to do something that actually mattered. Emily had saved him when no one else did. Now it was his turn to return the favor, but not in the way anyone expected. Morgan Freeman was a man of his word, and when he made a promise, even one spoken over a plate of eggs in a dimly lit diner, he intended to keep it. Emily Carter had given him something money couldn't buy. Not food, not sympathy, but dignity. And now it was time to return the favor. The next morning, Morgan sat in the back seat of a sleek black SUV, watching the city of Chicago stir to life. His assistant, Michael, sat beside him, typing furiously on his tablet. "So we found her," Michael said, barely glancing up. "Emily Carter. 29 years old. Lives in a small apartment on the south side. Works double shifts at Emmy's Diner. No criminal record, no immediate family except for her younger brother, Dylan Carter, who is currently in medical debt." Morgan frowned. "Medical debt?" Michael nodded. "Kid got into an accident last year. No insurance. Emily's been paying off his hospital bills ever since. That's why she's working so much." Morgan exhaled slowly. Of course. Because a woman like Emily wouldn't just struggle for herself, she was fighting for someone else. "What do you want to do?" Michael asked. Morgan didn't hesitate. "I want to change her life." That evening, Emily Carter wiped down the diner's counters, exhausted from another double shift. Her feet ached, her hands smelled like coffee and dish soap, and her paycheck was already promised to bills she couldn't afford. She barely noticed the familiar voice until it was too late. "I hear the food here is life-changing." Emily froze. She looked up. And there he was, not in a wrinkled suit, not bruised and lost, but in a tailored black coat, looking like the Morgan Freeman the world knew. She blinked, unsure if she was imagining things. "Mr. Freeman?" He smiled. "Morgan, just Morgan." She set the rag down, wiping her hands on her apron. "What are you doing here?" Morgan gestured to the empty seat at the counter. "Well, you fed me last time. I figured it's my turn." Emily chuckled, shaking her head. "I appreciate the thought, but I don't think I can afford wherever you eat." Morgan's smile didn't fade. "I think you might be surprised." Morgan led Emily out of the diner, ignoring her protest that she still had a shift to finish. The moment they stepped outside, she stopped dead in her tracks. Parked at the curb was a luxury car she had only seen in magazines. "This is yours?" she asked, eyes wide. "For now," Morgan said. "Tonight it's ours." She hesitated. "Morgan, what are you doing?" He turned to her, his voice calm but firm. "I'm keeping my promise." Emily swallowed. "I didn't help you, so you'd owe me something." Morgan nodded. "I know, and that's exactly why I'm doing this." She stared at him for a long moment. Then she sighed, shaking her head. "You're impossible." Morgan grinned. "That's what they tell me." The restaurant was unlike anything Emily had ever seen. A rooftop view of the city skyline, candlelit tables, and a menu with no prices. She felt completely out of place, but Morgan made sure she didn't. "Tell me something," he said, pouring her a glass of wine. "If you could do anything in the world, what would it be?" Emily hesitated, biting her lip. "I don't know." "Yes, you do," Morgan pressed. "You just don't think you deserve to say it out loud." She exhaled. "I always wanted to open my own cafe, a place where people could come in, get a warm meal, feel at home." She chuckled bitterly. "But dreams cost money." Morgan leaned forward. "What if I told you that wasn't a problem anymore? Emily's heart stopped. Morgan. I want to help you, Emily, not out of charity, not because I think you need saving, he smiled, but because people like you, the world needs more of them, and I'd like to be a part of making that happen. Emily blinked rapidly, emotions welling up in her chest. I don't know what to say. Morgan chuckled. A simple yes will do. Emily let out a shaky breath. This is insane. Maybe, Morgan admitted, but so was feeding a stranger who had nothing. Emily stared at him, the man she had met just days ago in the worst moment of his life. And now he was giving her the chance to change hers. Emily had once given kindness without expecting anything in return. Now she faced a terrifying possibility. What if the universe was finally repaying her? Emily Carter never expected her life to change. She had spent years giving without expecting anything in return, believing that kindness was its own reward. But sometimes, just sometimes, life gives back. And this time, life had given back in the form of Morgan Freeman. A month later, Emily stood in front of her own cafe. The sign above the door read, Emily's Place, where everyone is welcome. It wasn't a five-star restaurant, it wasn't a luxury chain, but it was hers, and it all started with a single act of kindness. Morgan leaned against the counter, watching as customers filled the cafe. I told you dreams don't have to stay dreams, he said with a smile. Emily laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible, you know that? I've heard. She looked around, taking in the sight of her dream turned reality. I don't know how to thank you. Morgan's smile softened. You already did, and she frowned. How? He gestured to the cafe, to the people finding warmth, comfort, and a place to belong. By proving that kindness never goes unnoticed. Emily felt her throat tighten, because he was right. She had once helped a stranger who had nothing, and in return, that stranger had given her everything. Emily thought she was helping Morgan Freeman that night in the diner, but in the end, it was he who helped her see that kindness is never wasted. Through this story, we realize that the smallest acts of kindness can have the greatest impact. Emily fed a man who had lost everything. She didn't ask for anything in return. She simply gave. And in doing so, she unknowingly changed her own life forever. Because true worth isn't measured by wealth or power, it's measured by how we treat others, especially when we think no one is watching. And in the end, the kindness we give always finds its way back.